Coming to you from the heart of the Diocese of Savannah, this is It's Catholic, Y'all, a series of conversations about faith and life. Views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily represent the views of the Diocese of Savannah.
Welcome to It's Catholic, Y'all. Joining us today are husband and wife who both hold doctorates in clinical psychology from Divine Mercy University. Dr. Garrett Boyer is currently the Deputy Chief for Embedded Behavioral Health at Fort Stewart and is an Army aeromedical psychologist. Wow. Okay. Dr. Laura Cusumano specializes in the treatment of eating disorders and is intensively trained in radically open dialectical behavior therapy for disorders of over-control, including depression and anxiety. Garrett and Laura have been married since 2016 and are welcoming their fourth child. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, I wanted to give you both a chance to maybe introduce yourselves a bit more, some of your background, maybe how you met.
Well, in terms of how we met, it's the shortest answer we can give right now is at school, at grad school. And that's a story for another day because it's a little convoluted. But thank God that we're here. We met in school and I was the TA for Garrett's basic interviewing and clinical skills class. So that's how it started. And but we did not begin dating until after that class was over. So that's the most succinct way to describe it. But yes, in terms of how we got involved in the field. And so this is going to sound like I'm going to go back to the very beginning, which I am, but only for a brief moment. So when I was a young girl, all I ever wanted to be was a stay-at-home mom and a Broadway star. And right now I have achieved one of those things, which is stay-at-home mom. So right now, although I do hold my doctorate in clinical psychology, I'm not practicing clinically right now. I am home primarily raising our 3 young kids with the 4th on the way and due in early October of this year. Thank you. And we homeschool. And when I have the time, I occasionally work as a part-time adjunct faculty member at Divine Mercy University. So I've taken a step back clinically, but I really love talking about psychology. And what got me interested in psychology was twofold. My love of musical theater. I loved being able to understand the person, to really delve into why a character would act the way that he or she does. And so it seemed that theater and psychology worked in tandem. So in my undergrad studies at the College of William and Mary, that's where I studied theater and psychology. And also at that time, I personally went through an eating disorder. And so I started going to therapy for the first time. It was the first time I really started contemplating what kind of help I could receive, like what was going on and the things that were bigger than me, issues that perhaps had been forming in me as a young person and then were culminating in this eating disorder. And so I sought out treatment and I really fell in love with the field of psychology. So then afterwards, I decided that I wanted to pursue that as something that I feel that God allowed me to experience that so that I could help other people, serve other people. So that is why I specialize in the treatment of eating disorders when I do practice clinically. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, I love hearing Laura's story because it's a reminder of the fact that we've all got a journey that leads us to where the Lord wants us to be. My journey has looked very different. I was not at all interested in psychology. As a young man, my trajectory, I thought, was going to be holy orders. I spent my whole life as a young person and then through early college years thinking I was going to become a priest. So I went to seminary, studied in the seminary for 7 years, and I got very close to ordination. But I especially remember towards the end of those theology study years, at that time you would start wearing the Roman collar. So you would look like a priest and you would be in parishes, helping pastors, doing things similar to what you might be doing as a priest, working with people, going to the hospitals. And what I found out very quickly was once you put that Roman collar on, people open up and they share a lot of things that they probably otherwise would not be willing to share with you. And I remember feeling just overwhelmed sometimes when these folks would approach me with some of the stuff that they would be wrestling with, either personally or with their families or friends. And I remember thinking so many times when this would happen, like, I don't know what to do to help you. You've definitely got some things going on, but it doesn't seem like it's necessarily of a spiritual nature. What I didn't know at that time was that they were in fact dealing with a lot of psychological issues, behavioral health problems, and I just didn't have the vocabulary, the skills, the training to be able to identify it, to really know how to help them in that way. And I started becoming more interested in that time with psychology because I realized, wow, there are a lot of connections between spirituality and psychology. And I was still thinking that priesthood was what direction I was going to take, but through prayer and discernment, I was able to determine this isn't the direction the Lord wants. I didn't know what direction the Lord did want and what direction I would end up taking. So after I left seminary, I worked in the Washington, D.C. area for quite a few years, doing a number of things, and I loved it. But I had the energy for graduate school, the desire for it, and I wanted to do it. And so I sent out applications, ended up getting picked up for graduate studies at Divine Mercy University, which was an excellent experience. In addition to a great education, I also found a wife. So it was, I got more than I bargained for, I guess, to say it that way. But no, that it was a blessing how it all worked out, and that's how I came to the field of psychology.
All right, so my question for both of you, and this may be too broad to be in one podcast, or maybe it has to be a separate podcast, but how have you each seen the field of psychology change, over the course of your lifetime or in the time being in the field?
Oh, well, yeah, that is a big question. I love it, though. I think it's a great question. I've noticed it change quite a bit, and for the better. One thing that has really impressed me, and I think back to the time that I was a young man, going throughout high school and then college and graduate school to now, is that a lot of walls have been taken down regarding this idea of stigma. Not that there aren't still some aspects of behavioral health stigma that remain, but I think in a lot of ways, society has become more receptive to the impact that behavioral health services can have for the better for people. And so definitely that idea of seeing help seeking as some sort of flaw or some sort of problem looks very different now than it did even 10, 15 years ago. I visited with some colleagues from different parts of the country. Interestingly, some of them will comment and remark that almost an opposite effect has happened, where now in some places it's almost become like trendy to have a psychologist or a therapist. And that's not necessarily right either, but I do think that it is interesting and kind of telling about where we've come in just the past couple decades. Really interesting. What are your thoughts?
So in addition to what you were saying about receptivity and the stigma decreasing, I think there's a greater emphasis in the field of psychology on strengths versus pathology. So back in the days of Freud, we were practicing psychoanalysis and trying to figure out what exactly happened and why are you this way, what went wrong in your life. And there was an emphasis on deficits as opposed to strengths. And through the past few decades, there has been the emergence of positive psychology, Martin Seligman's work. And so that has been incredibly helpful in the field to have people identify their character strengths and virtues. And I think that that's actually provided a space for what Divine Mercy University has developed, which is the Catholic Christian meta model of the person. And I know we'll be talking about that in more depth as we go on. But I think that we've changed the emphasis from everything that is wrong to how can we find that balance in you, that even if you are suffering in this way or exhibiting patterns of behavior that are not healthful or helpful, that you also have things, aspects of yourself that are good and that we can build upon and develop virtue and then move toward flourishing. And so that has been a major change in the field of psychology.
Yeah, and even the industry of psychology, when you think about industrial organizational psychology, it's this macro application of how can we make things at an organizational level better, function in a more optimal way, make things more smooth. Performance optimization and performance enhancement. A lot of sports organizations, teams, turning to psychologists and therapists to help people with skills of mentalizing, imagining, how are you going to make this shot? How are you going to make this putt? Athletes report that utilizing psychology and behavioral health services in these sort of ways really helps them in their craft. So yeah, definitely applying psychology in a way that has been so unique and different, but the right direction when we compare it to the way we saw psychology practiced for decades and decades and decades. Seligman became the president of the APA, and that was his theme, was positive psychology, and it really was a marked moment in America's approach to psychology, that it can have this positive approach. The APA is the American Psychological Association, and Seligman was chosen as president because of his research, because of the message that he could bring regarding this sort of application and approach to psychology.
Every field goes through so many pendulum swings, I would imagine, and we have so much what they call pop psychology out there right now.
Oh, yes, a lot of that.
So finding that middle ground, especially as Catholics who maybe you have a different idea of what's helpful than the secular world or non-Catholic world, is very important. It's great.
I agree. Yeah.
So on that note, how does your faith affect your practice? Like how do you view your work through your faith lens, and then vice versa?
Yeah, go ahead. You can start.
Sure, yes. So I think that for me, there's no other way to see psychology but through the lens of our Catholic faith. And I will say that, as a younger person, I really compartmentalized my faith. And so it was something very dear to me, but then I held it too close and didn't share it. And so over time, I really grew more comfortable. And I love that there are places like our graduate school, which allow you to integrate things so openly. And, I go back to a memory that I have from actually when I started therapy back in college. And I remember the intake therapist asking me what my goals were. And I said something along the lines of wanting to physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually heal. And I remember she was an older woman, middle-aged at that time. I was in my early 20s. And so she seemed a lot older to me. And she kind of chuckled at that and said, "Oh, that's a big ask." Like but I realized that dimension, so we talked about the physical, emotional, mental things, but less so about how it was affecting me spiritually and how it was affecting my relationship with God and other people that God had put in my life. And so I wanted to find a way that it did not feel like we were excluding the spiritual aspect of the person and the relationships, like I said, with God and others that God has put in our lives. I wanted to integrate that into my work. And so now, I think for me, the person with whom I'm sitting, the patient can be Catholic. The patient doesn't have to be Catholic. The patient doesn't have to even know that I'm Catholic. It's just, how do I see that person created in the image and likeness of God? And fundamentally, this person has dignity, and this person is suffering, but also, as I had mentioned before, like we all have these strengths and virtues that we can build upon. And so trying to see the person as best as I can in the ways that God sees the person is how I would say that I operate in terms of how my faith influences my work, and vice versa. Like I can't disconnect it at this point. It is so inherent and natural and just normal, and I think necessary, that it's I don't even know what my work would look like if I were to try to detach that at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, similar to you, Laura, my faith has driven the way that I approach psychology. But I will say then on the other side of it, the work that I do has also had an implication for my faith. What's interesting is that I work in a decidedly secular environment in the military, and I've never, of my own volition, introduced themes of spirituality into the sessions with these patients. And yet I'm just amazed how time after time after time, the discussion turns towards things of a spiritual nature, or these existential questions, or these ontological musings, because it's something that is so inherent to our very being as humans. And so when I'm sitting with a patient and they start talking about things, they may be referred for any number of issues: having trouble at work, feeling like they can't concentrate, having relationship problems. That's all good material to address and to cover. But as we start peeling back layers of that onion in the course of treatment, what becomes so apparent many, many times is that at the foundation of all of these things are these big questions of, what's my purpose in life? Where am I going? What am I doing here? And naturally that gets woven into that fabric of spirituality, existentialism, and it becomes important to address in the context of therapy and in session, because these are the kinds of questions that help us understand better who we are in a relationship to God, where we want to go with our lives, what we want to see happen with ourselves. And so as I've seen this dynamic play out so many times, it's really confirmed for me in my own faith that I'm on the right direction. I'm on the right path here. It's easy enough for any of us to have our spiritual challenges and our bouts with doubt, and we sometimes find ourselves scratching our heads and maybe even shaking our fist at the sky, wondering what is going on here? What's the meaning of all of this? And yet when I see my patients, my colleagues, my peers having similar kinds of experiences, asking similar kinds of questions, it's just a humbling reminder that we're all on this journey together. And it does confirm my faith that, okay, thy will be done, Lord. Holy Spirit, take over. Let's keep on keeping on.
Well, and just made me think just how grateful I am that we have a God who knows what it's like to have a human mind.
Yeah,
You know,
Absolutely.
he made it,
Yes.
first of all, so that helps. But then he took one on, like a human brain.
Incredible.
That it gives me chills.
Mhm.
But that's I was gonna ask too. This was not what I was planning to ask, but how have maybe some of the things in your faith changed since you started practicing?
Well, for me, I have been so grateful to understand more the depths of science's role in the human person, in psychology, and then how it just relates to this grand aspect of creation, created in the image and likeness of God. Wow. And that has some broad reaching implications, like neurology, for example, brain science. We've learned more about the brain in the last 10 years than we had known in the last 10,000 years.
Mhm.
And you think about these great frontiers, brain study is still, in a lot of ways, a new frontier that we are continuing to learn more and more and more about. And so the more that I have learned about it, the more that I've learned about human physiology, human biology, how this relates to behavioral health. Because for me, in my mind, so many of our mental issues, our behavioral health issues, have a deep root in human physiology. So as a psychologist, my standpoint is that if I don't know that, or at least I'm not aware of it, it's going to be hard to treat these patients and work with these people. Take trauma, for example, and I know you've heard me talk about this so many times. Sure, it's psychological, but it's as much a biological issue when you start talking about some of the physical symptoms that come with trauma issues. it's physiological. So the more that I have learned about the human biology, human physiology, the more just in awe I am of the greatness of creation and how blessed we are that we are created in God's image and likeness, and just how complex that really is. And it's just a wonder to try and wrap your head around.
Yeah. So I know we're here today to talk about happiness, and that's the theme of this month's Southern Cross. So, I mean, we're going to spend the next little while talking about that, but so what is it? What is happiness?
Can I start this
question.
one?
Yes, you can start.
So Braylon, I know you were at the Eucharistic Congress recently, and I got to see some of those videos, and I was really impressed with Bishop Barron's talk. But he, at the beginning of his talk, let out a little secret about himself and disclosed some information. And I thought, wow, I identify. He said that he was a big fan of The Simpsons. I'm a big fan of The Simpsons too.
Yes,
and I remember there was an episode once where at the very end, Homer is walking among the clouds and he's standing next to this gigantic figure in white robes, and you can see the beard, you can't see his face, but you make the mental leap that he's conversing with God. And he's asking the question, what is the meaning of life? Mm-hmm. And God says, the meaning of life is, and then it cuts to the credits.
Man.
Now I ask that because in a lot of ways, this question too, what is happiness? It's one of those big questions that we want to know more and we want to explore more. And you can't help but wonder, the closer we get to the answer, do we get that end scene, right, or that cut? Like, oh, it leaves me wondering, wanting to know more. And, it is interesting when you talk about happiness. I think it's a big question, a challenging question, because happiness can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I think it's important to establish some definitions and understand what you mean by happiness. And that's not an easy thing to do. So, for example, the APA the American Psychological Association, has just a very not detailed definition of happiness at all. What was it? You had read it.
I had read it, yes. And I wrote it down. It says, an emotion of joy, gladness, satisfaction, and well-being.
Right.
So thanks a lot.
Right.
What does that mean?
There's not a lot there. Yeah, and like Webster's dictionary says happiness, the state of being happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought you weren't allowed to define words using another
so that doesn't give us a ton to deal with, especially when we know just experientially, like there's got to be more to happiness than just that. Some theorists think of happiness simply as an emotion. The Catechism offers a definition, and I happen to like this definition because I think it's a little bit more robust. If I can read it here, it says, happiness, joy and beatitude over receiving the fulfillment of our vocation as creatures, a sharing in the divine nature and vision of God. God put us into the world to know, love, and serve him, and so come to the happiness of paradise. So I think that fills it out a little bit more and can provide some direction for having this conversation about happiness. In English, it's challenging because there are some constraints to our language, but in Greek, that Greek word eudaimonia, I think is a more broad and more encompassing idea of happiness as being more permanent and stable, more holistic. It espouses this idea of blessedness, of perhaps emotion. It extends further and it reaches more. And so when we talk about happiness, I think it's important to establish what it is we're talking about. Is it this fleeting emotional feeling? And if that's the case, then we have to understand that as an emotion, our emotions fluctuate all the time as human beings. So I might be happy one moment, but emotionally be very disappointed or disgusted or unhappy the next moment. Emotions are in a consistent state of flux. It's just a natural phenomenon of being a human. But if we talk about happiness in this grander scheme, something accompanying and encompassing a more holistic approach, perhaps we can view happiness as something being more stable over time. And then we can start to think about happiness as something that you can measure and track, and throughout the course of your life, start to think, have I been generally more happy or more unhappy? So those are my initial thoughts. I think there's more to unpack, but I'm interested, Laura, to see if you had any thoughts about those definitions as well.
Well, I think that the definitions, when I read them and hear them, I can imagine, I feel frustrated. So I can imagine other people being frustrated by the fact that we don't have a clear-cut answer, because it seems like many people in the field of psychology, the scientists, the researchers, they don't have a clear-cut definition as well. And so when Garrett was talking about how transient emotions are, I just thought, oh yeah, think about a small child. A child embodies those emotions so vividly. And we have 3 young ones at home, our oldest being 6.5 right now. So there's a lot of emotion that happens, a lot of big emotions that happen, and they can be ecstatic in a moment and so happy. And then all of a sudden they bump something over, or somebody takes their book, and that's it. Like, that is the end of that happiness. And so when I hear about it described as an emotion, like, that's so passing and so fleeting and so frustrating to think that one would always have to continue chasing that feeling if you believe that happiness is an emotion. And so when talking about it as more of a state of being, I really liked the Catechism's definition, because like, it's grounded in, if you don't mind opening it again, like vocation, like you have, so that there's so many things, thank you, that you want to put it into it has to be in the context of the way that the Lord created us to be, and the role that he has for us, our state in life, etc. Because I can tell you, all I ever wanted, like I said, was to be a stay-at-home mom. And there are some times where I am not feeling very happy in those moments. Like, it's a frustrating and trying time sometimes to be with little ones. But ultimately, am I happy? I would say yes, because am I doing my best to align my will with God's will for me and to live out my state in life? And so I think to define happiness, we need to put it in the context of the lives the Lord has given us to lead. And so even if something doesn't feel, I love emotions, but like it's frustrating. Like, oh, if it doesn't feel good, then you want to stop it. But thinking that there's something, you're doing this for a purpose. There's a meaning behind the suffering that happens that ultimately, I think, pays off into longer term happiness.
Yeah. And to that point, happiness is something that we intuitively know. I mean, we're biologically driven to seek that which is pleasurable. And pleasure has a connection to happiness. And we naturally try to avoid that which is unpleasant or harmful. Again, this is hardwired into us physiologically, biologically. And so we know what this experience of happiness is. But again, to be able to put your finger on what it actually is a little bit more challenging. And then, like you say, a lot of theorists, a lot of researchers have different ideas, opinions about it. I mean, I just did a search, what is happiness? And it had over 2 million hits. And so that's on Google. And then I went into like the APA's research domain and like psych articles. And in just the last 5 years, there have been almost 20,000 peer-reviewed articles and journal entries and books on addressing happiness. So it's something that understandably gets a lot of attention, but there's this challenge with understanding what exactly it is. And I think, Laura, you started to get more to what I think is an important component of happiness. This idea that there's something that underlies happiness, which is a fuller experience of that happiness. And some of the researchers define that as meaning or purpose. And I think when we have this conversation about happiness, it's important to recognize that happiness, like you say, if it's simply an emotion, it may come and go, and there may be times that I'm more happy or less happy, but that foundation of feeling a sense of purpose, understanding my meaning, boy, now that's some heavy material and some stuff worth really trying to unpack. You know, this idea of logotherapy, which came out of the writing of Viktor Frankl. I don't know if you're familiar with some of his literature, but he wrote an important book called Man's Search for Meaning. And in it, he lays out his experience of being in a Nazi concentration camp. I can't think of many places where I would be more unhappy than in an environment like that. He was enduring the kinds of hardships and sufferings, the likes of which we can't even imagine today. I think it's safe to say he wasn't in a happy place. But even in the midst of that, what he did find was that there was purpose and that there was meaning. And even in the midst of all of that hardship, all of that suffering, even though he wasn't subjectively experiencing happiness, he knew that there was that deeper rooted meaning and purpose, the kind of thing that no person could take away and that he had control over. So when we start to have these discussions about happiness, I think it's important to connect it to this deeper sense of meaning, of purpose. Because it's entirely possible that a person can spend a lot of their life being subjectively unhappy and not feeling that emotion of happiness, and yet still have a profound sense of meaning and fulfillment, and still feel as though they have a purpose. And for me, that's a very important point that I think should be emphasized more, because everybody wants to be happy. Again, we're naturally oriented to it. We want to seek things that are pleasurable, things that make us happy. But the truth of the matter is that we've inherited a fallen human condition with its flaws and foibles and brokenness and shortcomings. And we're going to experience some things that are going to leave us unhappy. We're going to experience things that make us sad. And yet, even in the midst of that, I still have purpose. I can still find meaning, even in the midst of the sadness and the brokenness.
Okay, so you gave a recent talk. You were both there, and you were giving the talk at Corpus Christi in Pooler.
Yeah.
I got to attend the second part. There was a two-parter. But you brought up at that session the Serenity Prayer that a lot of people are familiar with. It's kind of cross-stitch on every pillow and hanging on every wall. But it's the, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. How does that kind of thing play out in our Catholic view? Thinking of things like redemptive suffering.
Oh boy, we had this conversation earlier this week, and you had some important points that I think are relevant for this discussion as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Yes. So, the Serenity Prayer. So when Garrett gave this talk, he mentioned it, and it is something that has been incorporated into dialectical behavior therapy by Marsha Linehan, which is not the type of therapy that's for disorders of under control. And I do the radically open dialectical behavior therapy or over control. But anyway, so what the acceptance piece, I think, is the emphasis in the Serenity Prayer. I mean, we do say, and the things that I can change, to the courage to change the things I can, but a lot of emphasis is on the acceptance of what's going on in our, like the circumstances in our lives. And I think acceptance is the first step.
Yeah.
But it's not the complete the complete work that we need to do in terms of, say, understanding redemptive suffering.
Right.
So, because we can accept that something is there, but as we've been talking about, this meaning and purpose, putting it in the context of, okay, I'm accepting this, but why? What good is coming out of it? That's where I think we take the further step, the further leap into understanding redemptive suffering. That it's more than just, if we just accept something, then where does that leave us? Is my question. We can say we accept it, but then are we going to continue to fight it? Are we going to exhibit reluctance, a lot of distress around it, or just kind of a woe is me attitude? And I want to say that, of course we all are going to have our reactions. Like, I don't want to diminish feeling upset that this is happening. Like, I accept it. I don't like it, but I accept it. I'm not trying to say that, we have to be okay and hunky-dory with everything, because that's just not reality. But when we put it into the context of the greater meaning, the greater purpose, I think that is where we start to have a better understanding of redemptive suffering. So what good, how is this uniting me with Christ, for example? What good is coming out of this? Those are the kind of questions I have. And, it's funny because when you ask these questions, I recognize that I'm answering them with more questions and not really giving a straight, concrete answer. And I think that that's part of our journey as people, at our development as people, and our development in the faith, is to continue to ask more and more questions rather than be satisfied with an answer, right? Like, if we had the answers, people would be implementing them and life would be perfect.
It's very Socratic, and Jesus did
Right.
it, so
Right.
I think we're in good company.
Well, I appreciate that. So yeah, for me, understanding that acceptance is the first step, accepting that suffering, Jesus never said that life was going to be free and easy for everyone, if only that were the case. But because of the fall, we needed to be redeemed, and we have to suffer. Life is part of suffering. There's suffering in the good, in times that are good too. And, Garrett was bringing up earlier, like, the idea of labor, for example. It's not a pleasant experience, but the outcome is something that, God willing, will be a wonderful experience. And so I think that putting it, my word here is context. Acceptance is great. Accepting, yes, that, a woman needs to go through labor in order to deliver a child. You don't want it. You don't like it, perhaps. It's uncomfortable, very painful. And yet there's a reason for that suffering. There is a purpose behind it. And so then that makes it worthwhile.
Yeah. And this doesn't at all take anything away from the serenity prayer. And I like that you say it's this first step towards the redemptive suffering piece. But like we know so often for people, taking that first step is sometimes the hardest. Mm-hmm. And being able to get to that place where you can accept and then begin on that journey towards this meaning making of the challenges that we are accepting is a big deal. And I think for that reason, the serenity prayer is so popular and important. Like you say, you see it on mugs and you see it on pillows and you see it everywhere. But it is something that I think it's a hard step to take, and it is the first step towards getting at this sense of now redemptive suffering, but even getting to a place where we can, in humble docility, accept, okay, I don't like this, but it is what it is. That's a phrase that a lot of folks use, but I see it in therapy a lot. Before we can even have a discussion about redemptive suffering and the idea of the purpose behind all of this, getting to that point where they can just accept. It takes a real cognitive leap, a leap of faith, it's not nothing. But I think Laura is absolutely right when she says that acceptance is one piece of now a very large puzzle when we get to this level of being able to really understand the meaning behind whatever challenge it is that we are accepting.
Also just thinking too how much the first part, maybe we kind of gloss over that, like the change part, like, oh yeah, just change it. Like, well, I feel like a lot of therapy and just life is, well, how do you make any changes? And as Catholics, we're like, well, do I take control of the changes, or do I pray about it? And how do I? So there's a lot of layers. I can see that.
Yes, lots of layers. We're surrendering.
Yeah.
Like, okay, how do I work with God? Is this working against God if I try to take control, etc.? There are lots of things to contemplate.
Yes, and then like I've harped on so often, the fact that we as human beings experience the world physiologically, biologically, and truth of the matter is that happiness in a lot of ways is related to heredity. If we have parents who were dealing with depression or anxiety, there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to be dealing with depression and anxiety. And when we have these discussions about finding the purpose in suffering or the meaning in the hardships that we are wrestling with, we have to understand that part of that is meaning that in a lot of ways, this is what I have inherited. And this is apart from the choices that I make, the things that I do or do not do. Part of it is physiology. This is the way that I'm hardwired, and it comes from a generation, 2 generations, many generations before me. And I think that it's important to reverence that fact and to have some respect for the fact that we can and should take the right steps to try and do these things, to accept, to try and find that meaning in the midst of all of this, but also to give yourself a little bit of grace and have a little bit of patience for the fact that we can work with what we're given, and sometimes we inherit a challenging hand, and that's neither bad nor good. It is what it is. One of those things to be accepted, and then be this as it is. What do we do now? How do we make best with what I've been given?
Yeah, and maybe some of the change could be, well, this is what has trickled down, but what do I do with it now? What will be passed forward? So much as I can help it.
Absolutely.
There's not a lot you can't necessarily completely just change, but maybe you just notice the pattern and say, yeah, I'd like that to be done.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I think, that comes up a lot I look at blogs and, parenting posts, and I like to be in Facebook groups to observe themes. I don't really say much, but I like to look at what people are saying and see what's popular right now. And there's a big movement toward this like reparenting of oneself because of things that a person experienced as a child and says, I don't want to continue like this, the generational trauma, for example. And so exactly what Garrett was saying, what you've been saying, really, like these are the circumstances. This is my experience. And now I have a decision that I can make here. In as much as, I can make a change, what sort of change is what I like to see. I think that we see that a lot with gentle parenting, for example, when people say that that's a term to unpack for another day kind of thing, but it's a gentle parenting versus, parenting where perhaps the parents were more authoritarian and more demanding or critical or something like that. And so that it's the acceptance of, yes, this happened in my life. This was my experience as a child. And now I have a choice as a parent. How do I move forward, kind of thing? And I think that can be applied, that line of thinking can be applied in so many aspects of our lives.
I think what I've noticed is that the more at least from my own experience, the more I learn about these things, you can recognize the unhealthy things that you've witnessed or been given or whatever, but it also giving grace toward the people who've gone before.
Absolutely.
Because you're like, well, if I were in their shoes or whatever, it's
right.
From the faith point of view, we can't keep blaming Adam and Eve forever. Like,
Yeah.
us.
And that would bring us down a different route, but like the idea of forgiveness too, and
Absolutely.
forgiveness therapy, but being able to look at people and to give them the benefit of the doubt because they were doing the best that they could in those circumstances. And now we know more, like we have more research, et cetera, about, Garrett was talking about the physiology and the way that the body keeps the score. That's a very well-known book title from a trauma therapist named Dr. Bessel van der Kerk, and he talks about how trauma is stored in the body, even generational trauma.
Yes.
So yeah, it's something to keep in mind. We could go in too many different directions, and I want to keep us focused. But you're opening up a subject that's very complex.
Yeah.
We've been touching on this, but there's a tension between joy and suffering, right? So, and the saints talk about this kind of all the time. Some lean more on the joy, some on the suffering. But I guess what are some ways we might seek to have both of those, if, as they're presented to us, and some of the pitfalls that can come with either direction?
So when you asked that question, this was something that just came to my mind now in our talk, like live wholly the present moment. And I think that if either of you remembers, I do not remember who said that. I want to say John Moore, but I don't know who it was. So, but I believe that came from a saint, and basically accepting and I don't want to say reveling in, but accepting and experiencing the present moment. Because I think that sometimes we can become too focused on the past or focused on the future. And those are and dwelling on the joy that we felt and comparing it to how we feel now, which is enhancing our feeling of suffering, etc. Like that when we do those comparisons, comparison is the thief of joy. I'm sure you've heard that saying. That's on a lot of mugs and pillows too. And so I think that being able as much as possible to stay in the present moment and to ask God or Our Lady, like, what do you want me to learn from this experience right now? And I say this as somebody who has trouble doing this myself, but trying to bring the Lord into every situation. I remember a friend of mine, she would tell me about how when she was cooking dinner, it was like, a hard time of day for her, whatever. She would ask the Blessed Mother to come into the kitchen with her. And just to be there in that time of, it's the end of the day, things are pretty chaotic, everybody's hungry, we're all tired kind of stuff. And just how that allowed her to embrace whatever was the mood of the day, and be in that present moment with our Blessed Mother and then with our Lord. And so I think that ways that we can seek to have both is really, like I said, being present, inviting, because the Lord is our friend. Jesus is our friend. And so I think that just as you might pick up your phone and text a friend like, oh my goodness, this is, or I might text Garrett like things are at home, or, oh, they're so cute, or something like that. Remembering that we can do the same with Jesus or the Blessed Mother and say, like, just come in and help me to experience this moment with me. And so that might sound a little odd or something, but I think that especially as Catholics, we need to start normalizing that piece. And then, regarding pitfalls, I think it's, again, the dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. A lot of times when people dwell on the past, it brings up feelings of depression, either present or about the past. And then future is all anxiety, and and I can tell you as a person who is a very anxious individual, like I can think about upcoming events in our life. We've got some house projects that are coming up and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this week is going to be so stressful, so stressful. And what does that do to me now? It causes more suffering. Causes more suffering. It does not allow me to be present in the moment. And so, yes, acknowledging that joy and suffering are both going to be in our lives, that's just part of the human experience. I think that's the first step, acknowledgement, acceptance, and then embracing whatever the cross of the present moment is.
I'm glad you brought up the present, because I've just read some literature and some research which shows that really, as humans, we have the best insight and understanding about ourselves and our situation in the present. In fact, we're not very good historians of our past. And when it comes to forecasting possible emotions in the future, we're also not very good. And so there's been a whole bunch of research on this showing that if we look into the past and consider our happiness, we may overestimate or underestimate it because of cognitive biases that we have. And then the same thing when we think about the future. We may overestimate how happy we will be or how unhappy we will be. When the truth of the matter is that research shows exactly what Laura is saying. We are best to focus on what's going on here and now. As far as seeking happiness, though, in the here and now, we have some pretty good compasses to lead us in the right direction, especially as Catholics. I'm thinking about what the Lord himself said from John's Gospel. If you love me, keep my commandments, that my joy may be in you, and your joy may be complete. The time-tested traditions and values of the church, the sacramental life, are ways to enter into that happy communion with the Lord. Now, the caveat and the challenge to this is that we know all kinds of good people who do keep the Lord's commandments, who are doing the right thing, who are making good choices, and yet still experience sadness, hardship, suffering. It's not a guarantee that if we do these things that we're going to automatically experience all happiness and feel this emotion of happiness all the time. But again, that's where this idea of purpose and meaning comes in. Mother Teresa, towards the end of her life, it became much more known that she, in fact, had a lot of spiritual desolation, physical hardship, and suffering. The kind of things that if we were experiencing, I speak for myself, would probably make me unhappy. And yet underneath of all of that was their purpose, was their meaning, was there a life of beatitude and fulfillment? Absolutely. I think an important thing when we are thinking about looking for happiness or seeking it out or seeking ways of or experiencing suffering is to not go to any one extreme and to focus solely on seeking that which makes me happy. How many people do we find in secular society who are searching for the things that they think will make them happy? They believe this will make me happy, or this will fill this desire. And in fact, it doesn't. I'm thinking about young people who go out on the weekends and clubbing and engaging in all these different things. They want that communion with others. They want intimacy, whatever, believing that will fill some hole that they have in their life. And what they find out so often is that it just consumes them even more and leaves them feeling more unfulfilled. And then the opposite is true for other folks. Some of the lives of the saints are really fascinating when you hear about the kinds of penances that they choose. Sometimes they can be quite extreme. And I don't want to speak ill of any of the saints for sure, but I do know that there are plenty of Catholics, our peers and our contemporaries, who almost to an extent, I would say, over spiritualize some of their hardships and sufferings, and that doesn't really leave them feeling fulfilled or in a spirit of real grace or communion with the Lord either. So I think avoiding these extremes and trying to find the virtue in the middle, here and now, to me, that's an important thing to be aware of.
I'm just thinking of that word aliveness, like the glory of God is man fully alive.
Mm-hmm.
You can be alive in suffering, you can be alive and happy, but you're not living in death. You're not in this state of, the opposite of that, Anyway, thank you. I appreciate that. So what role, I think, kind of thinking back, I had a good conversation about the temperaments not long ago. I feel like a lot of Catholics have maybe a baseline understanding, or at least have heard the terms.
Yes, I've heard of them.
So, how does mental health interact with temperament? Is there any overlap? Is that legitimate? As a person who's more melancholic gonna be more likely to struggle with depression, or is that kind of a myth that we've put on people to kind of say, well, you're a sanguine, you'll never be depressed, or that kind of stuff?
Oh, we've got thoughts.
We saw this question. There were lots of thoughts, and I think that to be honest, I grew up Catholic, and I never heard of the temperaments until I got to grad school, which was a Catholic grad school, and it was not something taught in class. It was something that friends had heard in their own experience, and I think that there's a lot of overlap. I mean, this goes back to the days of Hippocrates and Galen, and using what they had at the time.
Right.
We've come very far since then. And so I don't want to say there's no value whatsoever in the temperaments, or even say, I mean, if you think about a more modern day one, the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI, people love to say, "Ooh, what's your Myers-Briggs," or something like that. And this is not, and I say this with caution because this is not something this is not endorsed by the church. In fact, the church condemns enneagrams, but I think that is, and so I've never looked into that. I know the word, but I know a lot of people say, I'm a such and such number. Mm-hmm. And so I will say I don't often come out and say like, don't do that or something like that, but that is something that I will say, avoid the enneagram. Just the church has spoken out about that. But anyway, all of those things that we've mentioned, enneagrams, MBTI, and the temperaments, they give us a picture using the knowledge that people had at the time to give you a broad overview of who you are, so to speak. And I think that sometimes, as you were saying, Braylon, oh, you're saying when you'll never be depressed or something like that, that as just an example, somebody might say, that's very much putting somebody who has a sanguine type personality in a box. Like, this is impossible for you. And what we need to remember, I think, is that they're descriptions, but they are not prescriptions for who you are and who you will be. Yeah. And so I think distinguishing that is very important, because as humans, we're all irrepeatable. We have all these experiences that are completely unique. My experience of happiness, for example, will be very different than Garrett's or yours, Braylon. And so similarly, if I were to be described, and I honestly don't even know what my temperament is, but say if it were choleric, I think it is, I don't know, that what it looks like for me to have a choleric personality is different than what it would look like. I won't be a mimic of the next choleric next to me, so to speak. So I think that it's important to recognize that we do like to fit into something. We do like an explanation about why we are the way that we are. And I think that's why when you look in the field of psychology, we have this diagnostic and statistical manual of disorders. And people have problems with the practice of diagnosis. Some people really like it, some people don't. And a diagnosis is a guideline. It gives us an idea of how we can treat the person with whatever they're suffering. And similarly, I'd say the temperaments are a guideline. And so, what do we know? We know that there is something called the Big Five, and Garrett will talk. He loves it so much, I'll let him talk about it. But we do know that people that are rated higher in neuroticism and introversion do have a greater chance of developing depression. But at the same time, somebody who's melancholic or phlegmatic, for example, in terms of the temperaments, they might seem more predisposed to experience depression, but perhaps they never experience an event that sets that off. Similarly, somebody who is sanguine might have if you want to use this language, like, oh, that, yeah, they're generally easygoing, but then something will happen in their life that will trigger, and this is known as the diathesis stress model, that something will happen in a person's life that will all of a sudden set things into motion that they were predisposed to genetically, etc. So I think it's really important. It's nice. And there's a book out there. People still talk about temperaments. Art and Lorraine Bennett, they have books out there. The temperament God gave you, the temperament God gave your spouse, the temperament God gave your children. So we're still talking about this in the field, but it's not the end all be all. And I think sometimes people, in our case, the Catholic population, has latched on to that, so to speak. And I don't think that it's inherently wrong or anything like that, but it's not the fullness of understanding a person. You can't just read a description in a book and say, that means I'll never have this, that, and the other happen to me because I'm this type of personality.
Right. I think anytime you try and put somebody in a box, we create some problems for ourselves because, well, what happens if my experience is outside the box? Then what do I do? If my conception of myself is I am exactly this way. Laura mentioned the big 5 personality factors, and I love these. And I think one of the benefits of modern psychology and research when it comes to personality has shown that our factors of personality exist on a spectrum. And so we are not, for example, either introverted or extroverted. Fact of the matter is that it exists on a spectrum because we all have elements of introversion and extroversion. I mean, think about being in a situation where you are the outsider in a room. You don't know anybody. Now, maybe there are some people who can go right into that environment and fit right in and do just great. But even somebody who's more extroverted might feel an inclination to be a little bit withdrawn in that situation. Nobody is completely one thing or the other when we talk about personality factors. So these big 5 that I had referenced, I love them. I think they're useful as far as talking about and helping us understand where we are at regarding our personality. The first one is openness to new experiences. Some people are more open to different things than others. Again, it exists on a spectrum. There's nobody who's completely closed off to new experiences all the time, and nobody who's completely open to everything all the time ever. That would be very dangerous.
Just as an example, just to think about openness, that, again, the word that I've been using a lot is context. So I consider myself, I am a very extroverted person, but sometimes I want my quiet time, et cetera. But I would say that I'm very open in new social situations. But when it comes to risk-taking or adventurousness, in terms of athleticism or physical fitness or physical things like hiking or skydiving or something like that, I would never do that.
Right.
I would never do that. And so Garrett's openness could look very different. And right. He is much more, I'd say, open to those new experiences of let's dive out of a helicopter or something like that. Let's try it. For me, that's an absolute no. I'm going to pump the brakes there. No, but put me into a room of people that I don't know.
Right.
And I would be like, this is great. So again, that openness on a spectrum based on situations.
Yeah. So openness is one thing. Conscientiousness is another huge personality factor. And as a matter of fact, conscientiousness is associated with a lot of other interesting things. People who tend to score high in conscientiousness tend to be better disposed with a lot of other important life things. They tend to do better in school or work. They tend to have better relationships. But again, conscientiousness exists on a spectrum. Laura will tell you that there are some things that perhaps I don't seem conscientious about at home. But then at work, there are things that I am extremely conscientious about. Not everybody is 100% conscientious or zero conscientious ever. It exists on a spectrum, but that's an important personality factor. We already referenced extroversion versus introversion. Again, important dynamic. Sometimes I'm more introverted, sometimes I'm less. But it is an aspect of our personality. And then there's agreeableness, another personality factor. Some people are inherently and naturally more agreeable than others. And there are times when not being agreeable can be very beneficial and helpful. There are times when it might be more helpful to be more agreeable. Nobody is completely agreeable. Nobody is completely disagreeable. But understanding where you might be on that spectrum and then how your spot on that spectrum may impact a relationship with somebody else who may be on the opposite end of the spectrum. And the last personality factor that are in the big five is neuroticism. And that has kind of a negative connotation, but I think what it is kind of getting at is this. People can define neuroticism a lot of ways, but it could have something to do with, I don't know, help me out here. How would you define
sensitivity to emotional experiences?
I want to be generous with how we define neuroticism, but I like that idea of that sensitivity. And again, some people are quite, for lack of a better word, neurotic. Others are less so. But with all of these things, and when we talk about like temperament, I mean, I think with the temperament, with these personality factors, what we're getting at is these are domains that are part of who we are, that make up our personality. But we can't pigeonhole ourselves into I'm all this or all that. So like Myers-Briggs, I'm an INTJ. But truth of the matter is that, introvert. Let's start with I versus E. Well, I'm also an extrovert sometimes, and I'm an introvert. Thinking versus feeling. I hope that the three of us and everybody has the ability to both think and feel. We do. And so to recognize that these things exist again on that spectrum, and we need to utilize certain areas on that spectrum differently at different times for different circumstances and different situations. So as a matter of fact, with the military, we use the big five a lot, especially for people involved in like special forces kinds of roles, because they're working in close proximity with very few other individuals doing very dangerous, very important work. And it's useful to know how you are as a person when you're working with a small team and how they might be. And when you get into a challenging situation, when stressors get ratcheted up, we tend to regress. Some of those base instincts come out. And if you understand who you are, your personality, as it were, it's beneficial to help make things work in a more optimal way. Not only in that environment, but now researchers have adapted this for corporations and businesses and that kind of thing. And I love it. I think it's got a lot of value and use. And when we think about it from the Catholic perspective, that idea of Christian, know thyself. If I know aspects about my own personality, that can be very useful as I navigate the spiritual life.
What would either of you say to anyone, really, but Catholics in particular, who may be reluctant to either approach the topic of mental health, seek help for any issues they're dealing with? Maybe they don't think it's necessary to get anyone involved. Or they're just like, I don't want to even think about this stuff. Some misconceptions they might have. How do you approach that mentality?
Boy, yeah, that's an important question and a big question too. You know, I referenced at the beginning this idea of stigma. In a lot of places, stigma is coming down. I do still perceive that there's plenty of stigma across Catholic culture related to behavioral health. So what are some things I would say? I would say, first of all, one misconception is that there's nothing I can get from seeking treatment that is going to really be helpful that I can't get, say, with my guy friends or my girlfriends. You know, I can just talk through my issues with them and that'll get me where I need to be and get me what I need. I think that is a misconception, and the research and literature confirms that. When you engage in treatment, actual therapy, the research shows that people who do this do get better, do experience fewer symptoms of whatever it is they're seeking treatment for. Why? Because therapy is an actual process, empirically validated, evidence-based, that's a very different dynamic and a different relationship than the kind of conversation I can have with my buddy while golfing, or my peer at work, or your friends at mom's group. Sure, you can talk about some of the same issues, but the approach in therapy with a trained therapist is going to naturally be different. It's going to be focused on the treatment and healing aspect. So if there's this misconception that I don't need it, I can get help elsewhere, I would challenge that to say, give therapy a try and see for yourself. That's one thing that I would say. What are your thoughts?
Well, to speak a little bit more about that, I think one of the benefits of a therapist is a neutral third-party observer. So when you're bringing in friends or family, they love us, I would hope, that if you approach your friend or family member with some concerns, they potentially have something at stake in this too. And so their advice might be well-meaning, very well-intentioned, but they might have some blocks to being able to see the full picture. And so perhaps might not challenge the person, or might say, well, absolutely, like if I think about like a dating example, like, oh, that person's not good for you, whatever, and diminish like the good that comes from being in a relationship with that person. Because as we've talked about, the danger of extremes that can happen in relationships all the time. And so just, I like to make things as concrete as possible. So to put Garrett's comments in context, I think, going to somebody who cares about you because you are another human being and they want the good for you, that's about all they need. That they can start helping you explore things from different angles in a way that a family or a member or friend might not be able to do. I think that another misconception about therapy that sometimes people will lead people, and particularly Catholics, et cetera, is like, well, we focus too much on the family, or like all this stuff that happened with my family of origin, right? Like the very psychodynamic view. Not all therapy is like that anymore. And so we've definitely grown in terms of our models, things that there's evidence that shows their success, things like cognitive behavior therapy, where there's a lot more taking action than exploring why. The most pure behavioral therapists and CBT specialists will say, you don't even need to know why this developed. You don't need to know why you have this thought, where it came from. You just have to work on the thought. You have to, we have to tackle this, and there are practical ways to do it. And so I think sometimes there's this idea of, oh, therapy is me laying on a couch and, unloading on this person and them saying, and this is what's wrong with you. That is a very, very outdated approach, I think. And then another thing, and I know this one might sound like a big leap or surprise for listeners, is that the idea that you have to find a Catholic therapist.
Yes.
And so that's a big one. And I know that might sound controversial, but honestly, if a therapist is well trained, he or she should be able to set aside their own worldview and to respect the patient's worldview. And now, of course, we know that does not always happen. So I understand there are definitely things in terms of issues that Catholics might face more than people who are not Catholic, like say scrupulosity. Could be very helpful to work with a Catholic provider, but you also want to make sure that that provider has experience with OCD, because scrupulosity is related to obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. And so I wouldn't want you to just go to any old Catholic therapist who's going to say, you want somebody who has that expertise. So in the field of eating disorders, for example, that is a field where oftentimes providers are a little scared of it because there are a lot of physical complications that can go, and medical complications that go alongside it, in addition to the psychological experiences the person's having. And so people often stay away from it. I love it. But I would want somebody, if your choice was to work with a Catholic provider who is experienced with, anxiety, depression, things that go alongside with eating disorders are often comorbid, we'd say, versus somebody who is a specialist in eating disorders who is not Catholic, I would say go to the person who's a specialist, for example, just because somebody who has real expertise and experience in that. And so I think that there's that barrier where people might say, okay, I've got a little bit of openness, people are recommending I should go to therapy, but I need to find a Catholic now. And then all of a sudden that wall is there. And that makes it really hard to get the help that a person needs.
I mentioned at the beginning when I was in seminary, I would meet these folks who would come and talk about a lot of things. I remember thinking at that time, and I've made this into my own kind of phrase or statement: don't spiritualize your psychology problems, and don't psychologize your spirituality problems. And I've seen this happen many times, regrettably, with some of my friends who are devout Catholics, with people that I've met in some of our parishes, is that they've got real issues related to their mental health, behavioral health problems. But instead of seeking treatment, what they'll try and do instead is crank up the spiritual reading.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go to spiritual direction. I'm going to make it a point to say more rosaries or the Divine Mercy Chaplet. I love all of that. I think all of that is super useful and very helpful. And at the same time, that spirituality lane is distinct from behavioral health. And now, don't get me wrong, spirituality and psychology so often go hand in hand. But I would really caution listeners who are really going through some kind of behavioral health issue to try and address it from a solely spiritual perspective. Jesus is the divine physician. He can heal, and he does heal. But because I also love the sciences and have a reverence for the fact that God created us as human beings, scientific in our very makeup, that all of these approaches that we can take to addressing our behavioral health issues are good, valid. I think that our Lord would be great seeing us get to a place where we're flourishing and functioning optimally. And maybe that means addressing it through a therapist or a counselor. Maybe it means addressing it with a physician. But to address these things solely from a spiritual perspective, so often it leaves people wanting and not healing the way that they would like to see.
And just one thing, when the question was people who are reluctant to seek help, I think reminding them, so maybe they don't have an aversion to therapy. They're just like, I probably don't need it, or something. They're like, my suffering's not that bad.
Who do I pick?
Right?
Where do I go?
This is too overwhelming. And so I think reminding someone that God created us in and for relationship. I brought up the Catholic Christian meta model of the person earlier, the CCMMP, which we also call the model of human flourishing. And that is a premise of the person, that we are relational, that I think is so important, that God didn't put us here on this earth to be like an island where we just try to figure it all out by ourselves. And so in addition to, of course, Jesus is the divine physician, and he can heal and he can miraculously take things away if we ask, but oftentimes what happens is he puts people in our lives to facilitate that. There are other instruments that he uses. There's the sciences, and there's just the human relationship that we have. And so I think that I would encourage someone to remember that in times of trouble, we might have a tendency to withdraw and isolate, which is actually really unhelpful.
Yeah.
Instead, we need to reach out. It's going to be hard. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to feel off, wrong, or something like that. But these are the times where I believe the Lord is inviting us to seek out these instruments that he has prepared. And not every instrument is perfect, believe me. Just because we're Catholic therapists doesn't mean that, like, oh, we're the best in the world or something. We are human as well. And so I think that's that important thing, the relationship where working with an individual, we get to continue to hone our instrument and that, God has given us these gifts that we continue to hone while working with patients. And then patients can receive just that help from another person instead of relying so much on themselves. And I think that I could go on and on, but it brings in surrender, et cetera. There's so many topics that we could talk about, but ultimately we're relational. God wants us to be in relationship with others. And so take advantage of that. Use it.
Yeah.
That's so important to us.
Well, when you were talking about, that there is a difference between therapy and just friendship, but I do think cultivating this healthy friendships will help a lot because we are made not to be isolated. The devil's the one who wants to get us off by ourselves, right?
Absolutely.
But just on mental health wise too, you need the people, but they're still not the professional who's going to help you walk through some of these very specific things. I'm just comparing it to like physical healing. You wouldn't just focus, like say someone got a compound fracture on their arm. You have to heal the bone and the muscle and the nerves and the skin. And then do PT. It's like you can't, if that's just for your arm, our whole person, think how much more we have to kind of.
And incidentally, in terms of the medical model, the doctor who's working on my arm, I don't care if he's a Catholic or not,
exactly.
or if she's a Catholic or not. I want to know that you can fix my doggone arm. So I think that's important to keep in mind too. But just as you're talking here, it makes me think, like, especially some of the disorders in the diagnostic statistical manual, the diagnosis of like depression, anxiety, trauma. Some of the symptoms are the withdrawing and the isolation, and so that's part of the problem is this withdrawing and that isolation, and even scientifically we recognize this as being problematic. Kind of interesting how this all ties together.
Yeah, we could go. This could go on and on. So we should probably focus and maybe.
The last couple things I wanted to just say. We're going to get into some resources that you would recommend for people, but just for a fun question, this still relates. So do you have any favorite saints that you love personally or from a psychotherapy perspective?
Oh my, yeah. We could go through a whole litany of the saints here, I think.
I promise.
Let's limit it to 2, 3.
Yeah, okay, gotcha. Well, I love St. Thomas More, and I think people think of him as the patron saint for lawyers and attorneys, those involved in legal work. I think he's got a lot to say about the human person and about human psychology. He wrote Utopia, which is important work talking about the best environment, kind of like what we're looking for as people. He wrote a beautiful work called A Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation. Beautiful stuff. So I love St. Thomas More. But I also really have cultivated a relationship with St. Giuseppe Mascati. St. Giuseppe Mascati was a physician from Naples. He lived at the end of the 1800s, and then he died, I think, in 1927. But he was a scientist. He was an instructor, a scholar, a physician. He was about the business of healing people. He sought to do that physically as a physician, but as a doctor, he was keenly aware of that spiritual part of the human person and how nourishing that was beneficial as well in their treatment. There's a great story about him when he was the attending physician for the hospital in Naples when Mount Vesuvius erupted. Of course, everybody in a traumatic situation was scrambling, unsure what to do. Giuseppe Mascati stayed behind and took out of the hospital paralytics and elderly and those who were in the psychiatric ward, and did all of it with love and grace and compassion. And it's just a beautiful story about him. Incidentally, I once knew a family from Naples. They ran an Italian restaurant in rural Maryland, and the grandmother, her mother, was a patient of St. Giuseppe Mascati's. And she would talk about how, as a young person, her mother would have met with the doctor and had some just remarkable stories to tell. And so I have always invoke the intercession of Saint Giuseppe for my work as a scientist, as a psychologist, and I love talking to others about him as well, because I think he's a little more obscure.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that story.
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible story. Yeah. So I would say Saint Dymphna is very well known as the patron saint of mental health disorders. And just a brief synopsis of her life was that she was a princess in Ireland, and her mother died when she was about 14 years old. Her father started suffering very much in terms of his mental health. It deteriorated, and was advised to remarry, and he would only marry someone as beautiful as his wife. And that was his daughter, in his view. And so she escaped and would not, he wanted to bring her back to where they were living and to marry her, and she refused. And so she was martyred by her father. And so she is known as the patron saint of mental health disorders and those suffering with depression and anxiety. And so actually she is, I know I've brought up our alma mater, Divine Mercy University, often, but they're going to have a dedication very soon for their St. Dymphna Chapel. And that will be very beautiful. So she's very important to the school and for mental health. And then just for my personal, I love St. Rita of Kasha is my girl. I love her. She just had so many things happen in her life, various states of life in terms of her vocation. She was a wife and a mother, and then later a nun. And so her husband was murdered. Her sons wanted to take revenge on the murderer. And then she prayed that that would not happen. And then they died of an illness. And so she had so much loss that she experienced, so much suffering. And if I remember correctly, they didn't want her to be part of the order initially, I think. So it's like there was just a lot of rejection and hardship. And yet she continued to be dedicated to whatever the Lord was calling her to, even if it was hard. And so I love St. Rita very, very much. And so I think that she can also be someone that we can ask for her intercession in these times of need.
Well, thank you so much. Those are all amazing people to get to know.
Oh, yes.
So again, any recommended resources for people who'd like to learn more about anything we've talked about today or your work specifically? How can they find those things?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, do you want, I just want to plug this book only because right now I'm not doing, I'm not going to be teaching this year because, baby coming in October and everything, but there's a giant tome called A Catholic Christian Meta Model of the Person, Integration with Psychology and Mental Health Practice. And we were blessed and honored. I know some people might be looking on video, so I've got it here, but blessed and honored to work with all of the editors in school. And so a lot of the people that contributed to this very large description of the person, this model of human flourishing, we have worked with directly and have been trained under directly. And it is just such a rich, robust understanding of the person. And I believe there's a book of psychological premises. These are the philosophical and theological premises of the human person. And I believe there will be a forthcoming, I don't know how soon, but psychological premises of the person. And so I know it's a large book, but it's, even if you read the first introductory chapter, just to recognize the variety of dimensions of the person and to just build this, it encapsulates so much that we are just so richly created. And I think that in working with people, it's important to have that grounding.
Great. I'll link that in the show notes if I can find it.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. You have it on Amazon. Yes.
Okay. That's great.
I can't compete with the Catholic Christian Meta Model, but I have a YouTube channel, which is not nothing.
It's not nothing.
Several months ago, we were at Mass at the cathedral, and as I was listening to the gospel, I just remember thinking, wow, Jesus gets it. There is some real relevance. Yeah. There is some relevance to our scriptures that impacts our thinking, our psychology. And so what I've done each week is a quick meditation or reflection on the gospel, but looking at it through a lens of psychology. and behavioral health. Because I think, of course, we think about the scriptures as being so rich to nourish the spiritual life, which of course it does. But I think that there are a lot of connections that can be made relating the gospel, the scriptures, to our psychology, our behavioral health. And so it's called Gospel Minded. I put up a new video each Sunday, and would love it if people were able to check that out as well.
Absolutely. Well, Garrett and Laura, thank you so much for sharing, and I do think we must have a part 2.
Oh,
I would love
it. I mean, we could talk for about 5 more hours, I'm pretty sure.
Goodness, yes.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being on It's Catholic Y'all, and we will make sure that people get in touch with your resources. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Braylon.
It was great to be here today. Thank you for the opportunity.
This has been an episode of It's Catholic, Y'all. Visit us at diosab.org or on our Diosab social media platforms for more.